Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. So I was just saying again, welcome to the webinar. Today we're going to be presenting on the qualitative results chapter. Let me go back a few here. So here is a general list of the components that will go in the results chapter. You will typically include the introduction, the setting, demographics, data collection, data analysis, results, trustworthiness, and summary. Here at Statistics Solutions, we do help students from start to finish, depending on your needs with the dissertation. We have research mentors on staff, qualitative mentors, and quantitative mentors. So depending on what your dissertation is on or the area that you need assistance with, we do have a number of people on staff that can help. You'll notice some links in the chat. Sierra has posted some resources that may be helpful to you all. We do offer a free 30-minute consultation to help students identify where they need the most help. But for today, I'm going to be going through the qualitative results chapter, and then at the end, we'll have some time for question and answer. So again, this list here is a general starting place of what you'll want to include in your results chapter. I always recommend that students reach out to their reviewers or their committee to see if there's a specific template or checklist that they are expecting. That's just helpful in case there's any different sections that your school requires. It'll help you make sure all of your bases are covered. But if you don't have a resource like that available to you, this list is a good place to start as well. So in your introduction, you'll want to restate the problem and the purpose of your study. This is not somewhere where you want to get creative. These should not be stated differently anywhere in your dissertation. So everywhere that you're restating the problem and the purpose should be restated verbatim. It may start to sound redundant, but I recommend fighting the temptation to mix it up, because if you change the language, it could impact the meaning of your problem and purpose. So really just thinking about copying and pasting that section where you can, trying to make minimal changes when possible. And then once you do that, you'll want to remind the reader of your research questions, so you can list those out for the reader again. And then you'll want to present an overview of the chapter by previewing the sections to come. So that can look like just listing out the different headings that are going to be presented in this chapter. The next section that you'll want to report is the settings. So the setting is where you conducted your research. And I like to think of this as writing down what the readers need to know to better understand the results and understand the interpretation of the results. So thinking about what the context the reader needs in order to understand the results that you're going to be talking about. So any conditions that might have impacted your research or influenced your research or your participants should be reported here. Also, anything that may have impacted the interpretation of your results should be discussed here. So if you think back to your methods chapter, chapter 3, you have probably talked about and established the setting for your study, but that was probably during your proposal phase. So you were probably outlining a specific setting in kind of like this ideal world when you were in that planning phase. Things may have changed from the point when you proposed your study to when you actually collected your data. So here is where you'll start talking about how they've changed. So thinking about those different conditions that may have influenced your participants and anything that may have impacted the interpretation of your results. Next, you'll want to talk about the demographics. So you will want to talk about any information or characteristics about your participants that is important to the setting. Again, here you're just establishing the context for your reader so that when they're going through your results, they knew who you're talking about. So you'll want to think about anything that your study that was very specific to your study. So maybe you're conducting some type of organizational study, looking at administrators in schools. It may be appropriate here to then report the age of the participants. It might be appropriate to report how long they've worked at a particular school or their highest level of education. So really just getting down to those factors that are going to really, give the reader an idea of who these people are. Another example could be if you are conducting a study of maybe homeless women in a certain shelter. The demographics might differ there. So maybe age is still relevant. Maybe gender is not so relevant because your study is specifically about women. So you might not need to report gender. You may want to report how long they've been homeless. So really just thinking about the different demographics that are meaningful for your population or for your study sample. This can be presented as a table or as a narrative format. But no matter how you decide to present this, the main thing is maintaining confidentiality. So you don't want to present so much information that your participants become clearly identifiable to someone else. You really want to be able to maintain their confidentiality. And you can do that by using ranges. So if you're reporting age, you can report an age range instead of an exact age per participant. Or just by thinking of ways to kind of obscure your data to just maintain that confidentiality. So here you'll also present results on data collection. So again, thinking back to your proposal, you've already outlined clearly how you plan to collect your data in your methods chapter. And by this point, you've already collected it. So you just need to write about what actually happened. So you'll report any deviations from what you proposed to do in your methods chapter to this point. So for example, if you were planning to collect data in person, but then maybe due to COVID-19, you weren't able to conduct interviews in person. Instead, you had to switch to video conferencing or Zoom. This is where you'll report that deviation. So you will talk about how many participants you collected data from, the frequency. So if you collected data at 2 time points, you want to report that here and make it clear what type of data was collected at each time point, the location where the data was collected, and how you recorded it. So if you were doing interviews, how did you audio record or video record and then transcribe that into data that you could actually analyze. So here you'll describe that in detail. And then again, you'll want to detail any variations from your plan that may have impacted your data collection. So going back to that pandemic example, if you weren't able to achieve a specific sample size, or if your data collection process was lengthened because you had to recruit for a longer period of time, all of that information is helpful to include here in this data collection section. Next, you will report on your data analysis. So you already have a data analysis plan, and here you're going to just be going through what you actually did. So how that particular plan was applied to the data that you collected. You really want to be granular here. So you want to talk about the codes that you developed, the categories that you developed, and then also the themes, if that's appropriate for your data analysis plan. So you'll want to explain to the reader, imagine that they have no idea about qualitative analysis, how you went about going line by line and coding the data that you collected, if that's the method that you used. You'll also want to talk about the system that you used. So I know some students will use things like In Vivo or Deduce or MaxQDA. So if you used a particular software to organize and analyze your data, you'll want to make that clear here. And then you'll want to talk about also, even before you got to that data collection step, how was your data transcribed? So did you transcribe by hand? Did you use a transcription company? And then going along with that, how did you ensure that that data was accurate to what was recorded in your interviews or your focus groups? So some ways that you may do that are having participants read back their transcript to ensure that it's accurately capturing what they feel their experience is. Another way could be just auditing the transcript yourself. So just going through it and listening to the recording and matching it up. So just thinking about what that process looks like for your study, and then just making sure you're including it here in this data analysis section. Another thing to take in consideration here is any discrepant cases or negative cases in your data. So if there are any participants that just seem to go against the stream, which it's not uncommon that, one or two participants may be very different or may have a very different experience from the others, you'll just want to talk about what your plan is to address that here. So with qualitative data, you definitely don't want to throw out those cases. You don't want to get rid of any outliers because their story is, telling a particular story. So you'll just want to describe how you handled those discrepancies in your analysis. So the results can be organized in a few different ways. So kind of think about this as breaking the chapter in two. So in the beginning, we're telling them everything that we did to obtain our results. We're describing our setting, we're describing our sample, we're talking about the demographics, and then we're letting the reader know what the process was to analyze the data. And then in the second piece, we're actually describing what the results were. So this is going to be where you're reporting the categories and the themes that emerged in your study. So the decision that you make for the presentation really just has to be what seems most appropriate for your study and what you can defend. So it may make sense to organize your results by research question. It might make sense to organize it by category or theme. It kind of just depends on the data you've collected and how your study is structured. Again, if your school requires a particular way, then you should definitely follow that way. But generally, there's no specification for how this is done. So I know personally, I like to write my results sections by theme. But if a particular paper that I'm working on, it just doesn't seem to flow, or if the themes don't seem to overlap enough, then I might do it by research question and kind of have it set up that way. So it really just depends on what you have. Then as for the presentation, you should be using mostly your own words. So it should really just be you describing any participant observations, any experiences that you seem to notice, participants commonly discussing. So mostly in your own words. Now, the whole thing doesn't have to be in your own words. You can also pull in supporting quotes from participants and use any excerpts from documents or photographs or notes from observations that you may have done as well in your data collection. But mostly, again, this should be in your own words. You will want to discuss your data and interpret it as appropriate as you can. So I say that because there are multiple qualitative designs and not all of them allow for interpretation in this section. Some of them require the interpretation to be later on in the discussion section. So when you're getting to this part, it's important to think about your research design as well to make sure that you are following what's outlined in that design. Okay, and then I mentioned discrepant and negative cases earlier. Again, those are the people who don't match the patterns that you're seeing in your data. So we don't want to omit these because they provide alternate explanations and illustrate, that there's variations in the human experience. So we do want to keep these in. But here you'll just want to discuss what those cases were. And I recommend that you do it at the case level or the category level. So instead of having a general paragraph that describes discrepant cases, if you are organizing your section by theme, I recommend talking about it within the theme. So if you had a theme that says teachers engage in professional development courses, and it seems that a lot of your participants talk about going to different trainings and professional development opportunities through their school, but then you have one that says, actually, I never do that. Instead, I do XYZ. As opposed to describing that change outside of the theme, I recommend just doing it right under the theme so that the reader can really clearly see, how participants differed. So one thing to take into account is visualizing your findings. You can absolutely use different visualization methods, so tables, figures, maps, drawings, but I do recommend using them sparingly throughout the chapter and really determine if they're going to be contributing in a way that's helping the reader understand or if they're just kind of there. If it's something that seems like it's organizing your findings in a way that makes it really clear to the reader, then it's great to keep in. I know personally I use tables typically to show the hierarchy of themes, so to show what codes contributed to what category and then what categories contributed to what theme. Another way to use tables is to show the alignment with the research question. So they can be a really helpful tool. But again, just thinking about, is this a necessary tool or can I write a narrative that's going to do the same thing? And then anytime you do use a table or any type of visualization, it's just important to include a narrative so that the reader isn't abruptly coming upon this table. So you just want to describe what the table has in it and, just kind of give a brief description. The trustworthiness is also something that you probably included in your methods chapter. So here again, you'll talk about any deviations from the plan in your methods chapter. So you'll want to talk about how you established trustworthiness in your study through transferability, dependability, confirmability, and credibility. You probably talked about how you intended to establish each of these. So for example, in your methods, you may have said that you were going to conduct member checks to establish confirmability and maybe even credibility. But then maybe when it came time to do your study, you weren't able to do member checking because you couldn't follow up with participants. So whatever that looks like for your study, you'll just want to describe how you carried these things out. And again, any deviations that may have happened. And if you did deviate from your plan, you'll want to talk about what you did instead to ensure that your study is maintaining trustworthiness. And then at the end, you will have a chapter summary. So here's where you'll just want to highlight any findings. If your reader didn't get a chance to read your chapter, this is where you'll put, the main points that you want them to walk away with. I do recommend when you use your summary chapter, you have a paragraph for each of the subsections so that even though it's a summary, you're still hitting those high points and still including all that information that's in the chapter and not just, a small subset of it. And then after your study, you'll want to transition to the next chapter. So you may say something like, in the next chapter, I will discuss or I will review the implications for practice or, whatever it may be that you're going to be talking about in the discussion. But I think that we can open it up for questions. Again, we do provide a 30-minute consultation. So if you're struggling with writing, I know the results chapter can be pretty daunting because you kind of have all these this data that you just need to synthesize and find themes in. So if it's something that you're struggling with, please do reach out. We're here to help, and we have some resources online that may be helpful for you as well. And I believe that Sierra's put it in the chat. Yep, so that's there. But we can open it up to questions. So if you have any, feel free to put those in the chat. Okay, so I see one question. It says that I'm using IPA and have too many themes. Do you have any tips for cutting them down? I would say if they feel like very distinct themes, like completely different domains, I wouldn't recommend cutting them down. But if they if they kind of converge, like if they're over different topics, then I would actually turn them into categories and have a larger theme. So like one example is, let's see, let me pull from my memory banks of papers. So one example, I worked on a paper and my categories were things like strained relationships within a family unit, or past substance abuse, or custody issues. And I bunched all of those categories under a greater theme of demographic characteristics that contributed to the outcome. So that could be one way to do it. If they are similar, but different enough to turn them into categories, and they might contribute to an overarching like indicator for whatever you're studying, you might be able to just bunch those all together. And